Okay, it's 12:40 p.m. where I find myself empirically for the 30th of September, and I intend to talk for at least I say 1 hour, maybe slightly less, slightly more, because I want to make my video successful eventually, and I reconsider my worldview every time that I have encounters with empirical people, which make me wiser in a way, because I lost myself in, or I found myself, maybe both, in metaphysical abstractions over the years. So, but first I begin, maybe that's the most hypocritical, but using Kant to try to pretend that I can universalize my behavior. I don't know, but I will, maybe I will not, probably I will not be good, but at least I understand what good ought to be. And here I will be serious. I find myself at a moment in time where there are so many informations coming from everywhere in terms of the news, my empirical life, my intellectual development, the writings of Hegel, what I anticipate, what I said, what I thought, what I believe in, so many contradictions. So I have stopped over the past, maybe the past week, trying to control, consciously anticipate everything, and I decided just to let go, but not in a completely reckless manner. I mean, I try to obey certain moral principles, and one of them being Kantian. I haven't read Kant, I've read partly but I kind of understand they need to be rational, to be moral, rational. I'm not saying that it's easy or that I have been or will be moral, but what should be done, they need to act according to a principle and to structure one's own behavior by trying to follow the principle. That's Kantian ethics. The problem is that sometimes the consequences of being morally consistent can be pretty problematic, and sometimes that's where utilitarianism comes into play, namely to judge an action not by its accordance with the moral principle. That's the Kantian view, namely if you obey your own moral law, if it can be universalized, it's right ethically, but then the consequences can be negative. And the other way, I simplify, is the Anglo-Saxon empirical view, namely the morality of an act ought to be judged by the consequences, whatever the principle that drove or motivated. It's partly Machiavellian, it can be, but in the good sense, namely in the sense that an action will be considered to be moral if it has good consequences, whatever the inner motivations were. I simplify to the utmost. But here I will try to be a Kantian, namely I said to myself, in all my video I will just share some books, the references. People, when they watch this, what I advise them to do is just to look at Amazon or the websites which sell these books. Look at the comments, and you will notice that many people are becoming aware that there are problems with the educational system in the United States, but not just the US, in most Western countries, because here I introduce my logic. It's not my logic, it's just logic. The singular is contained under the particular, which itself is contained under the universal. So the educational system or the bureaucracy in the United States of America, it's just a singular case of particular countries, namely mostly Western countries, but actually it's universal. Wherever there are bureaucracies or educational systems, there are problems, but it's more prevalent in Western countries and probably even more in the US. Yeah, and Also, let us talk about morality. I will promote these books. What I recommend people who watch this, when they do this, if they have the opportunity, try just to act rationally and with wisdom in the management of the household. I will not do this, or very limited, because I try to be fair. Not always, maybe, but sometimes I try to. And here's a book, just a scientific, modern social sciences, which explains the variation in wealth, democratic rights, and the well-being from a bourgeois perspective, and linked and connect this with cognitive ability. It's a balanced book in terms of modern, up-to-date knowledge, scientific honesty, but also because it's partly honest, it's kind of it might be considered controversial, but it's very moderate controversy. It simply states the recent discoveries of sociobiology and psychology in terms of intelligence and variations between various human groups and various individuals within the same group, and connects this to social and economic phenomena. So that was for the introduction. And now, I intended to, I will talk randomly, but actually no, I will talk about politics, and maybe I will cut the video. I would like ideally not to make videos longer than 25 minutes, because otherwise I know people will not take the time. So maybe I will speak for maybe 50 minutes or more, I don't know, but I will cut the videos in 2 or 3 depending, but whatever. I would like to talk about politics derived from empirical experience, so my singular self, this individual. I have empirical encounters in my daily life because I have to live in the world and to buy groceries and to go out just to walk for a few minutes to rest my mind and to appreciate the air and the sun and the rain even sometimes, and just to live not a normal life, because I live in my library all day, but just to go out sometimes slightly, just to the daily conveniences. And I have developed a very complex, logical, metaphysical, speculative view, which I still know is correct. At least my interpretation may not be correct, but the rigorous aspect is correct. But my worldview is being strengthened by encounter with ordinary reality, namely the lives of ordinary and the worldviews of ordinary people. In a sense, it confirms my system, because my system has to incorporate negation within itself, and also it makes me come back to earth, and it teaches me humility. I have to become humble, because I started by being very humble, then I became arrogant, and now I have to come back down to earth and find a sense of humility. I know, this is wisdom. So that's why I promote mostly libertarian views, because that's my view of a balanced, of a compromise, in a good sense, in the realm of politics. And here I will insert links. Yeah, I forgot to say this, now I've been talking for many minutes, but I will insert the links to at least 5 of my videos, which I recommend people to watch, because they are my best videos probably in terms of intellectual rigor and content, while still being accessible. And I have worked very hard, and the reason why I'm making this kind of video that I'm recording now is precisely to be more loose, one might say, more open in terms of... I don't like this, but I have to. I prefer when I make rigorous videos. But I know that here my moral duty tells me I have to make my videos successful, and I know that what people expect is, oh, just be yourself, talk ordinary language, forget your system, which I hate partly, but I have to accept it nonetheless. So here I'm serious. My best videos in terms of intellectual content are those about logic, the phenomenology of spirit. It's not how I call the video, but this is the phenomenal appearance of Geist or spirit, and the Encyclopedia, which is what I call the view of God or the system. So actually the 3 books by Hegel that I've been rewriting, these are not books, it's simply my own interpretation of the logic, the phenomenology, and the Encyclopedia. So I will put the link, and the purpose of making videos like these is partly it's self-investigation, I must admit, but partly also to try to speak ordinarily, to reach a broader audience, and what I can recommend is to watch my more serious videos. Yeah. So now let us talk about politics. On a singular level, my individual self, I suffer from imbalance and maybe excesses, and I seek balance on a chemical level, emotional level, intellectual level, on all levels. Maybe I seek, unconsciously or consciously, I seek balance, stability. And I know from an abstract standpoint that political libertarianism is some sort of the good compromise. So I admit that I am imbalanced, but I nonetheless, in my sane moments, politically, I can anticipate that libertarianism is the ideal compromise, at least for Northwestern Europeans, or for most Europeans, not only, but because precisely if it was just a particular case, here's that the Kantian side, it would not be good. But basically one of the problems is that libertarianism is a good idea because it can be universalized, it rests, it is founded upon the non-aggression principle, upon universal values, upon liberty, a sense of individuality, which has to be precisely counterbalanced by the absence of the state in a libertarian society, or the very minimum state intervention, which forces the various individuals to find a spontaneous collective balance, which forces to counterbalance the individual freedom by a collective morality. So in a libertarian society, that's not what the book talks about, but I try to express the necessity of a spontaneous order emerging from libertarian political individualism, because if there are only individuals and no statist authority, the individuals are forced, or because of human nature, which maybe is controlled by God, not maybe, which is controlled by God, to be moral and virtuous and ethical, in a way. And here, I speak as honestly as I can, as far as I know, someone like Charles Murray, he understands, because he has a culture and he's smart, that when the US, in the 19th century, when really the state was limited, the individuals, they were virtuous, not because they were better than today, although on maybe some biological level, the processes, the Industrial Revolution, etc. But no, maybe they were slightly, but they were, I'm talking about the WASP, the Protestants. They were not better 2 centuries ago than they are today, simply, or maybe they were, but it's kind of insignificant for the idea that I'm trying to express, is that they behaved in a more virtuous, more moral way, simply because they had to. Because the circumstances were more difficult on an economic level, there was no state, no redistribution, the wilderness had to be conquered, the negative aspect, but basically they had to be self-reliant, and collectively they had no choice, and also it was inspired, in the historical perspective, by partly Puritanism and also the Protestant work ethic, etc. Unconsciously, because the Protestant work ethic only emerges as a topos, as how to call this, a concept in ordinary sense, a sociological concept with Max Weber at the end of the 19th century, whatever, but the white Americans of the 19th century, they had to behave morally, virtuously, ethically, and in a collective way, although they were individualists, because precisely they had to be self-reliant. And this ideal in the modern era, in the imagination of maybe white people with a culture, it's becoming more and more rare. That's a joke. No, but yeah, I'm trying to be honest and to express ideas that I myself do not fully understand, but basically there is some sort of the myth, in a good sense, the myth of the American, not the American dream, but the American, the manifest destiny. Maybe over there's the negative aspect, the Indians, and yeah, but the myth of Americans, they had found, at least that's what an aspect of me believes, that they had found the key to political, I wouldn't say happiness, but yes, actually political stability through what I call common sense. But then there are contradictions, because a libertarian society, that's one of the many contradictions. First, mostly white people think about such a society as being ideal, and then there has to be a minimum standard of quantitative intelligence. Yeah, so that's maybe the problem, because on a universal level it is good from a Christian perspective, because it respects individuals, it respects responsibility, a sense of self, of the worth, the inherent worth of the individual, universalized behavior. So in this sense, it is Keynesian and Christian for the good, but then there is the reality, and in reality there are ethnic oppositions, there are cognitive inequalities, there are wicked tendencies, selfishness, etc. So there is the ideal, and then how to reach the ideal. Yeah. So yeah, I will talk. My first video will be, because I've been talking now for 18 minutes. I will just say what I wanted to say, the idea that came into my mind. And here, I'm not in the mood to say, when I say ID, it's just Denkbestimmung, which is what I think actually. That's why I'm saying this. But there is the logical ID of Hegel, and then there are IDs in ordinary sense, Denkbestimmungen. Yeah, I have had to renounce, because here, the more I come back to reality, the more I realize that I had lost myself really or found myself, or both, I don't know, in metaphysical abstraction, because sometimes just ordinary vocabulary, while nonetheless trying to be rigorous, but not trying to control every word like in a, yeah, it can be helpful. So yeah, what I thought about after empirical encounters with ordinary people on a political level. Here I will speak with my heart. I am not good, but I will say what I would say if I were good, or if I were evil, or I don't know. No, I will say what I think without overthinking. That's part of my Protestant self. Sometimes I just have to let go, not completely recklessly, but to I will say what I think. On an empirical level of consciousness, so in this sense I cannot lie, because empirically I know myself to be limited. My higher self maybe, or lower self, maybe they are deceiving me, but on an empirical level I just say what I think. When I see what I call craftsmen, simply it means, it's a little bit of sociological jargon, people who are not bureaucrats or factory workers or high service jobs, people who are craftsmen. It can I would include even hairdressers. They are not strictly speaking craftsmen, but basically people who work, who are the masters of their own work. They produce their own commodities or objects or production without being factory workers. So they really have a... Here it's my leftist self, namely I still have the idea that the intellectuals, they are kind of lazy and they are not real workers, and for me a craftsman is someone who is the master of his own production on a physical level. There has to be a... Here I have not thought this through, that's what I think spontaneously. Someone who produces something tangible, or these can be shopkeepers who are the owners. So here, what I call by craftsmen, I try to think sociologically in real time, people who own their small business, the shopkeepers, as Napoleon would say, with England, the shopkeepers, the real craftsmen, the farmers, the producers who are rather more or less autonomous. So basically, the workers without the blue-collar factory workers, the bureaucrats, and the really smart people, teachers, CEOs, bankers, lawyers, etc. So really, the working people in a right-wing society. Because the right wing, really the traditionalist right, the European traditional right, for them the Industrial Revolution is a problem because the good aspect is that it brings suffering to the working class who now becomes factory workers who have to perform debilitating tasks, that there is a part of compassion in the traditional right, the old order, that we do not find in the capitalist right, namely the bankers and the financiers who only care about business and they fire their employees and they don't care. So there are various levels of right. So we find kind of compassion for the small people, the workers in the traditionalist right, but also kind of disdain for, not for the workers as workers, but for the trade unionists, namely the workers who are not satisfied and who try to bring imbalance to the traditionalist order. So in the classical right-wing perspective, it's not strictly speaking right-wing, it's reactionary right post-French Revolution, namely those who want to re-implement or reinstall the old order. They have compassion for the ordinary workers, especially those, I mean, first, those who work the land or in their the craftsmen, but then even for the blue collars, the factory workers who emerge from the Industrial Revolution, but also they are kind of, they have disdain, not for them as such as workers, but they have disdain for the elements of the working class who want to rebel against the aristocratic order. I've tried to express in a few minutes just a very, not very complex, but it's kind of subtle. So yeah, in this perspective, I kind of think like them, in a way. The reactionary right, the European reactionary right, namely my political ideal, one of them, here I speak empirically, would be a society where the small people, in terms of prestige and eventually party intelligence, they would not be exploited in factories. There would have to be debilitating tasks because it's part of the social fabric, but they would have to be limited in a sense. But the people, the ordinary people, they would be allowed to have their own business if they have the motivation and the will to be small owners of farms, to start a business without the complexity. They would be encouraged to be self-reliant. So it would be kind of a mixture of right-wing aristocracy and modern classical liberalism in a good sense. But also there would be a common consensus, knowing that there are inequalities within a society, and that there has to be a hierarchy, and the most, not necessarily the most intelligent, because it can give rise to technocracy and with the degeneracy of the bureaucracy, but the most, the best, it partly includes intelligence, but also there are standards of behavior and reciprocal obligations. So that would be the aristocratic aspect, namely a society where the little people, the small people, they would be encouraged to be as autonomous as possible and self-reliant as they are, but still having to obey an aristocratic order, and they would both agree, there would be tension, but basically that would be a modernized version of aristocracy where everyone would acknowledge the need for a hierarchy and everyone would find more or less of course it's an ideal, but they would find more or less satisfaction. And these are the kind of ideas that some factions of the libertarian they promote. And here I will pick up this book. These are the kind of ideas, namely the economics and politics of monarchy, democracy, and natural order. So that explains partly the aristocratic, monarchic aspect of libertarianism, of really the right-wing libertarians. It seemed completely contradictory at first to combine liberal or libertarian individualism with monarchy, but actually it makes sense, although he's not a monarchist because he says that what he calls natural order would be more efficient and more just, etc. But that's why there is a monarchic tendency within the libertarian of the US and even partly of Europe, namely the idea that there has to be a political order. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the good guys, in my view, these are the political libertarians, which in itself is a contradiction because precisely libertarians, they seek to abolish politics, but the intelligent ones, they understand that there has to be politics in order to enable the absence of politics. Here is not very clear, but basically I understand vaguely myself, namely the aristocratic libertarians, namely they are kind of the good guys, if I had to say. But the problem, you wanted us to be decent men in an indecent time, yeah. And the idea, the realization, there can be example in European history, in the Middle Ages, where some city-states were relatively more free, etc. These are the kind of references, or even in the 18th and 19th century in Central Europe under some monarchy in Austro-Hungary Empire, or even Germany, some states or some I don't know what's the English word, the duchy, I don't know the administrative distinction in English, but yeah, some localized federal political organization or political units. There were a relative stability. Of course, it was with the economic standards of the 19th or even 18th century, but this was the kind of ideal, namely a mixture of peace, virtue, prosperity, hierarchy, order, a sense of belonging, culture, religion, yeah. The old order, but there's a reason why the old order has been disrupted. It was not as ordered as it should have been, because otherwise it would have remained stable. So there were contradictions. But another example, so that would be the European ideal, aristocratic, and then transposed in the US from the perspective of a European. Here I speak as a particular type of European with vaguely a culture. The ideal as envisioned, and there probably is a fantasy, and actually it's different, but the American political life in the early 19th century, and even slightly before, and up until the Americans started to become prosperous and then decadent. Here is the kind of the tragic aspect, namely that the Americans, that's what I think, with my limited empirical knowledge, but they had found the perfect recipe for political stability, but it was so perfect that it brought about excesses because they were virtuous, hardworking, intelligent, religious in a good sense, without the excesses of the puritanical fanaticism. So they were hardworking, virtuous, independent people, but the consequence over time is that they became prosperous. And eventually here, that's a change of measure, and eventually they have to become decadent because it's logically determined. Namely, when there is too much wealth, too much prosperity, too much enjoyment, too much leisure, etc., the people becomes decadent. It's not their fault. It's simply inscribed within God's plan. I don't know. But I know that some people might understand this. I mean, that no one is guilty, basically. It's just that the Americans, they were too good for their own good. it's not very ordered and very structured, but basically that's what I think, broadly. And the people like Charles Murray and Ron Paul, and the libertarians, they would like to go back to a time when the balance was balanced, precisely. And here I will talk empirically. I've read political scientists or anthropologists, American anthropologists of the turning moment, the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and these people, they were already going away from the American ideal as a purely universalist creed. People like Stoddard or Madison Grant or what I call the American nationalists, but they still would they understood that. That's how I envisioned it. They had to become more right-wing in order to preserve the American ideal that they understood with the rise of modern science, scientific discovery, scientific anthropological realism, eugenics, etc. They understood that they had to protect the ideal, but then there were excesses in Europe, with Germany, etc., and their ideas became were brought into disrepute. But here, that's really the sad aspect, that someone like Stoddard looked at backward or retrospectively. He looks like a bad guy, but actually he wasn't. It's just he tried to be balanced while not giving up on demand and requirement and an aristocratic mindset. So he was demanding because he promoted kind of an inegalitarian view, but not in the view of us, the aristocracy, versus them, the mob, but in a organic view, but not oppressive, with the ideal of liberty. That's very difficult to express. Maybe that's why it's so difficult to implement politically, because it's already very difficult to just express with the proper words. But I kind of understand myself, I just have to give name. Basically, the right-wing aristocratic libertarianism, but not with the arrogance of the right-wing that can be found in right-wing circles, kind of a popular right-wing libertarian movement, which precisely because it's right-wing and popular, it's not right-wing, and then I say it's not popular either. I will go back. I will mix American sociology and my empirical experience. I just saw statistics about American political life. Basically, it also helped me come back down to earth. Maybe there are 22% of all Americans who are either libertarians or leaning towards libertarian. So 22%. In my view, which is kind of deluding, but at least half of America was libertarian. But actually, no. In white people, it's 29%. Leaning or libertarian by the Pew Research Center. And in Afro-Americans, it's 6% leaning, and in Hispanics, maybe 12%. So that's where there's the problem from the libertarian perspective. Then it's a universalist ideology, but actually there's mostly, not only, but mostly one group of people which seeks to promote this ideology, and these are mostly white males. Yeah. Although the ideology ought to be universalizable. I know it's not a proper expression, but not universalist, not universal, not universalized, but would have the potential intellectually to be universalized. The potential to be universalized. And here, well, Kant, if an idea is good, one ought to would like to share it with others. But yeah, that's complicated. So here's just the political talk, and then the impossibility, inability to have been the failure of libertarians to implement their inability to implement their ideas brings about frustration in some of them, and they become even more right-wing. Yeah, but yeah. And now I will just talk about I will make a second video, but now I just like to talk about politics, just to conclude with empirical example. If I spoke with my good heart, if I have a good heart, the ideal society precisely would be where the ordinary people, in terms of IQ distribution, status, social origin, they would be able just to enjoy working. Because here there are the leftist tendency, the leftists want to remove the suffering of those who are exploited. That's the good aspect of the left. And then the other tendency, which is excessive, is just those who want to promote the welfare state and to bring forth, unconsciously or consciously, but the consequence of their will to help the poor is that they fabricate, they create poor people and dependent and parasitical from a social perspective people. So the victims of social parasitism are those who are dependent. They are the first victims, so they are not to blame. If I speak honestly, the drug addicts, the beggars, the criminals, the welfare dependents, they are not responsible, but it is the social system which brings about quantitatively a greater proportion of these people, because it's not by increasing the bureaucracy that one solves the problem. It can help slightly, really, when there is a problem. Okay, money from the state in times of really hardships, it can help, but it's not a long-term solution, because I will not enter into very complex explanation, but basically the bureaucracy is inherently inefficient, because the bureaucrats, they are disconnected from reality. They are given unlimited amount of money. Of course, it's not really true, but they are given money taken from the taxpayer, so they are not really they can afford to make mistakes without having to be corrected, etc. So that's why it's inherently parasitical, the bureaucracy, when it goes beyond a certain measure. And yeah, so my ideal, I'm not saying that it can be implemented, but it's just, I speak empirically, where the common people, they would be encouraged to find satisfaction in their work. And I know that the ordinary people who have the opportunity to work a meaningful job, meaningful doesn't mean easy. A farmer, in non-Western countries it's really, really difficult, but even in Western countries the conditions are difficult. But if he finds meaning in doing his job, not his job, his work. Here, job is service, bureaucratic. Work is more real, one might say. If he finds meaning in doing what he does, he will be happy to work. And he will accept his place within society, knowing that in a common sense society, there has to be elites, but here is the American mentality. Elites who are elites not because they are wealthier, but because they are some sort of moral standards. This is what Charles Murray talks about. It doesn't mean that they have to be perfect in their all the aspects of their life, but at least they have to be more intelligent, more educated, and more responsible, and more virtuous in the classical sense of virtue, not the more modern virtue of the left, which is just virtue signaling. I am anti-racist, whatever, I am anti-masculine, whatever. No, this is degenerate virtue signaling, but really virtue in the political sense, people who are more educated. Here it's really the good American tradition. There is Mortimer Adler, the guy who wrote How to Read a Book, and Charles Murray. These really are Americans with a culture who knows that a political, historical, intellectual culture, and they use this to promote really good ideas. And of course, yeah, but the ideal would be a society where people like Ron Paul and Charles Murray, they would be considered good people. And we live in a times where they are accused by factions of the right of being too soft. I mean, someone like Murray probably. And on the left, they are accused of being a far-right extremist because this is insane. And here I'm not in a mood to find this funny. This is really insanity. Someone like Charles Murray, he is just the embodiment of common sense. And common sense in a society which is not crazy should be in the middle. Yeah. And here I will just conclude about politics. Here I am in a mood to speak honestly with my good aspects, if I have good aspects, but here I'm in a stable mood. The question of race. Someone like Charles Murray, again, basically, race ought to be. Let us imagine, okay, things are the way they are, we don't know how it comes into it. Just a society where there is diversity. Let us forget the great scheming, the world state, whatever. Just, there is diversity, this is how things are. What do we do about this? The first thing is just to speak rationally about race. This is race realism by acknowledging that there are differences, and here, that's where really the libertarian ethos is morally superior, namely intelligent people, whatever their origins, they would be able to have a peaceful, enlightening conversation about race, and they would find no problem in talking about IQ and other differences between the various groups and the distribution. They would find this common standard of, I would say, enlightenment values in a good sense, or simply rules of not politeness, rules of how do you call this? Gentilhomme, we call this in European tradition. The gentilhomme means the man of the 17th century who mixed some sort of aristocratic values with being slightly open to new ideas, although in the 17th century there were not still new ideas, but basically the gentilhomme was the aristocrat who was not closed down in his aristocratic circle, but already opening up towards the rising bourgeoisie. That's the sociological analysis. Maybe I'm deluding myself, but basically an aristocratic mindset of dialogue and inquiry, and this is what, here I'm honest, people like Thomas Sowell, they are good people because they are people who can elevate themselves to the level of universality for the good of society in a way. Yeah, so the question of race, the leftists, they might be partly good-hearted in trying to prevent the discussion of race because it brings excesses. Of course, racism, here I'm also in a stable mood. Killing people because of their origin is insanity. But preventing people from expressing stable, peaceful, common sense ideas is also partly insane, and it brings about frustration in right-wing people who become more and more right-wing because they are denied the ability just to state the obvious and to speak rationally. And this is the problem, the political problem. And that's why if people, I know it's probably not possible as of now, but if people could talk peacefully, rationally, a lot of problems could be solved. But the problem is that it's not possible because there are conflicts within reality, there are opposed tendencies. But this is the reason why I have been promoting these books, although I have suffered from right-wing excesses that I've tried to counterbalance with left-wing excesses. And honestly, if I speak to myself, I think that I have become crazy over the past month. I mean, I am slightly recovering, but I have become really insane because I try to counterbalance by white leftist excesses of self, maybe I'm deluding myself, but of self ethnomasochism to try to counterbalance the excesses that I've had in my intellectual development of, I wouldn't say even pride, but of simply attention and care. Maybe that's not the proper way of caring, but attachment, maybe, to white people. So I've had the two excesses, and now I've tried to find balance politically, and what I would call a balanced view from a white perspective would be libertarianism. And I will conclude on this because this is an idea that is becoming more and more clear in my mind. For me, libertarianism is really, that's how I envision things, an attempt to solve the contradiction, namely it's a overwhelmingly white ideology, but which is nonetheless universalist in the good sense. So it enables white people to be who they are, namely a particular group of people who reaches towards universality. But then the problem is that the others, first, among white people, there are a lot of whites who are not interested in libertarianism. But here, really, the socialists and the libertarians, they can coincide and really come into agreement with one another. But yeah, there's first the problem among white societies, and then towards other societies, libertarianism ought to be universal and to be good, but there are probably many people on this planet who would not be interested. But simply libertarianism, even if we remove the capitalist aspect, is simply a society where people can find a proper balance of individual liberty, which historically is a predominantly European feature, so individual liberty, but with the balance of collective well-being in terms of ethics and partly prosperity as well, but also in terms of the collective life. So there's the individualism, but with ties to the community in terms of culture, ethics, morality, collective behavior. That's how I could formulate this. Yeah, that's how I understand things. That's my intellectual attempt to solve the contradiction between the particular and the universal. Really, that's how I understand things as of now. I've been talking for probably 50 minutes, so I will stop there. And I will record another video on another topic, maybe. And then I will work for the rest of the day.